Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are continuing on with our Unit 5 lectures. We are going to be looking at independence in the Americas. So, how did the Enlightenment influence revolutionary movements in general? We have already learned about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. We learned about the revolutions of 1848, the Haitian Revolution. Now we are going to be learning about the revolutionary movements in Latin America. So our objective, you will be able to explain the causes and effects of the various revolutions in the period 1750 to 1900. Let's begin. So we are going to see that Latin America moves towards revolution in the early 19th century. So what are its causes? Well, there's obviously going to be multiple causes. First thing that will influence the Latin American revolutionary movement will be the European Enlightenment. I really can't overstate how important it is that you understand the ideas proposed by John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau with the social contract, that you understand the ideas of Adam Smith, because their ideas are so hugely influential on political movements around the world. Also influential will be the American and French revolutions. The American Revolution, because it is going to be successful, right? Because they are going to be able to successfully overthrow the British. And the French Revolution, because it is a revolution that is actually revolutionary, right? The American Revolution, you just had wealthy landowners who didn't want to pay more taxes. With the French Revolution, you actually had the poor rising up. And in part, that's one of the reasons why the first French Revolution won't be as successful. In both cases, though, you had important documents emerging. The Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The Haitian Revolution will be influential because you see a revolution in the Caribbean, in South America, right? Sort of in this region. A plantation revolution. And then, of course, you will have Napoleon's invasion of Portugal and Spain. What does it mean to be a Spanish colony when Spain has been conquered by France? In general, you can't understand the Latin American revolutions without understanding the social hierarchy within these colonies. So you have a substantial number of white Creoles, right? A Creole is someone of European descent, but has been born and raised in the Americas. So these Creoles have been here for decades now, right? Generations. The first sort of establishment of this social group was going to be in the 16th century. So it's been a couple hundred years, and they are concerned with the policies of Spain and Portugal, and more importantly, they are concerned about a potential loss of their own power. So, even though life as a Creole, life in the colonies could be very frustrating, especially because Spain and Portugal both had policies in place designed to benefit them primarily, there was little desire for change. That is until Napoleon invades. It causes a crisis in legitimacy, right? Shouldn't these colonies hold out, right? Say like, no, we are not going to fund Napoleon. Isn't the most Spanish thing to do to resist French rule? The Portuguese royal family, in fact, will just flee Portugal for Brazil and rule from there. However, the Spanish king will be forced to abdicate and Joseph Bonaparte will be made king. So, patriots fighting against the French will create a junta to control the colonies. And then you'll see the formation of local juntas and then constitutions. So by 1824, all Spanish South American colonies had declared independence and tried to establish republics. We will see that the Spanish Caribbean colonies will not reach independence until the late 19th century. So all of this is happening in part because of the formation of new political groups. These new political groups are going to be heavily influenced by contemporary European political attitudes. So you have centralists and federalists, right? These are people who both agree that, hey, the new colony should be a republic, but what kind of republic? A centralist wants a strong, centralized national government with broad powers. Federalists want regional governments, right? So sort of, do you want more of a United States model with the Federalists? Or do you want to have more of sort of a standard unitary government? Then, of course, you have conservatives and liberals. Centralists and federalists are looking more at the formation of the government. Conservatives and liberals are more concerned with what are the rights of the individual. Conservatives wanted a strong, centralized government. They wanted to keep Catholic Iberian heritage alive, and they strongly supported the Catholic Church and its influence. Liberals wanted rights to individuals in a more secular society. So in general, this is a very conservative revolution, right? You can align the Latin American revolutions more closely with the American Revolution than you can with the French or the Haitian revolutions. The French and the Haitian revolutions were liberal, right? You're actually overthrowing the status quo. Those who lacked power before have power now. However, in North America and in Latin America, it's the elites who want a revolution, and they want a revolution to maintain their own power. They don't want the poor to have more power than them. They don't want to give the right to vote to slaves. They don't want to free slaves, right? They don't believe that mestizos and native peoples should have more rights. They just want to stop having to answer to Spain, right? If you get rid of the Spanish, everyone moves up sort of one rank in the social hierarchy. So here's Latin America in 1800. You can see how much of it is colonized. By 1830, how much of it is independent. This is a huge change that will happen incredibly rapidly. We see independence movements begin in New Granada and Rio de la Plata. Okay, so where were those, right? So the Viceroyalty of New Granada is going to be what we consider to be Colombia and Peru, Ecuador, whereas Rio de la Plata will be really Argentina. So let's begin. In 1811, you see a revolutionary junta, and this is like a council of Creoles in the city of Caracas, declare independence. They want democracy. But they are also defending slavery and oppose full citizenship to Black and mixed race people. They essentially just want to expand their own privilege by getting rid of the Spaniards. This is a conservative revolution. They don't really want change. So, 1811, you got this junta declares independence. The loyalists in South America begin to fight back. The junta turns to one Simón Bolívar. You need to know who Simón Bolívar is. He is the most important military leader in the struggle for independence in South America. He's a Creole. He's born in Venezuela to wealthy plantation owners. He travels to Europe and will study the Enlightenment. He is charismatic. He is intelligent. He is well-spoken and well-written. And he is flexible. He is going to be able to adapt his objectives and policies to attract new allies even after defeat. For example, over time, he will agree to support the emancipation of slaves because it will meet his end goal of independence. So he will lead military forces in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And he will end up writing a primary source that you will look at called the Jamaica Letter. The Jamaica Letter really expresses Bolivar's outrage at mercantilist policies that restrict free trade in Latin America. And it's best understood in the context of the attempts of Enlightenment thinkers to influence resistance to existing political authority. So, you have Bolivar involved in the fighting. It will continue until 1814 when a constitution that limits the power of the king and the church will be proposed, right? They're essentially saying we're willing to be sort of a constitutional monarchy, or almost more of like a Canada situation. We'll still honor you as king, but we want to be independent, basically. The king says, like, that's fine. The Catholic Church says, that's not. And this is going to split loyalist supporters. Are you against revolution because you favor the monarchy or because you favor the church? So patriots will end up liberating Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. The army will then move into Peru and Bolivia. So between 1819 and 1822, you see the viceroyalty of New Granada becomes independent, and it now becomes the country of Gran Colombia with a republican government. Right? Bolivar's goal was to sort of create a South America that looked like North America, right? That looked like the United States, where you had a single sort of federal government, but people were able to sort of rule their own small regions. It's not going to work, right? Bolivar's dream of uniting all of South America under one government will be a failure. So by 1830, you have Gran Colombia has fragmented into Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Meanwhile, in the southern part of South America, the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata will declare independence as well. It will become the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata and will, over time, shift its borders until you just end up with Argentina specifically, and then, of course, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile. The thing to understand about all of this in Latin America, in South America specifically, is that in many ways, it's as if the Confederates won the Civil War, right? What the Confederates were fighting for was a continuation. They didn't want change. Whereas the North was in favor of change. So because of this, because in South America, the Creole elites, those already in power, won and thus remained in power, you will see continued and in fact increased oppression of native groups, of minority populations, increased exploitation of natural resources. They are going to act in ways that benefits their own immediate wealth. These Creole leaders didn't declare independence because they have this grand vision for Argentina, right? This goal of building a nation. Instead, they want independence so they can make themselves more wealthy. And they will then continue to make choices to make themselves more wealthy, even if it means that the poor, the masses, and even their country itself will suffer. As long as they're getting their own benefits, who cares about anyone else? What about in Mexico? Well, Mexico's going to be a little bit more complex. Mexico is going to be the wealthiest and most populous colony, in part because of the silver mines. And the fact of the matter is Mexico City was larger than any city in Spain. By 1800, Mexican Creoles far outnumbered the Peninsulares, and these Creoles were wealthy, educated, and powerful. So, Spain had cut deals with many native populations and had in fact restricted the spread of Creoles to some extent. We see that the British had done the same thing in North America. This is one of the reasons why you see support for revolution, is because colonists wanted to expand further west and past the Appalachian Mountains. But the British government had cut deals with the Native American tribes there, saying, hey, we won't invade west and take more of your land. Same thing, right? The Spanish had cut deals with some of the Native American populations, saying, hey, we will restrict our ranching and our farming. And the Creoles wanted to expand. So with Spain no longer in tight control, ranchers began to aggressively force Amerindian communities from their land. In 1810, you have a Creole priest named Miguel de Hidalgo who will urge mestizos and Indians to join the rebellion against Spain. This means joining with Spanish officials and Creoles as well as Peninsulares. The problem is, other than being anti-Spain, they don't really have anything in common. So a year later, the Creoles will turn on Hidalgo, because remember, these Creoles don't want to actually empower the downtrodden, and Hidalgo will be executed. Jose Maria Morelos will pick up the mantle. So he is Mexican priest and former student of Hidalgo, and he will lead forces fighting for Mexican independence. He too will be captured and executed in 1815. Then you have Agustin de Iturbe. He is a Creole officer, and he will lead the revolution against Spanish control as well. He's going to cut a deal with the mestizos and the Indians. And when Mexico declares its independence, Agustin there is going to be named Emperor of Mexico, which greatly offends his liberal supporters. During this time, the Mexican Empire includes our Central American states. Think Guatemala, Belize, Nicaragua, Honduras. Panama is part of Colombia. By 1824, however, this Mexican empire is overthrown. Agustin is executed, and instead you have the Republic of Mexico. By 1838, our Central American states are divided into independent nations, and all of this is the result of instability and will continue to be incredibly unstable. So, in 1824, the Mexican Constitution was technically federalist, right? We have a republic now. But although it's federalist, it honors these sort of internal provinces, it will still ignore a lot of the problems. We are going to talk more about the Mexican Republic later, so I'm just going to briefly go over these points. Essentially, you are going to have a civil war inside Mexico as this new republic decides on how it wants to divide power and govern itself. Ultimately, though, this just leaves Mexico really vulnerable for foreign invasion. All right, I'll talk about all of those things later. For now, let's talk about Brazil. Well, first let's talk about this question. What were some of the events that affected the Latin American revolutions? Okay, Brazil. Oh, Brazil. This guy. You may have seen pictures of him before. He is, in fact, a meme online because his name is insanely long and because he has no chin. So, remember, when Napoleon invades Portugal, the Portuguese royal family gets on a boat and flees to Brazil. So they're still ruling, but they're just no longer ruling from Lisbon. Brazil is incredibly economically important to Portugal. It provides sugar, cotton, cacao, slaves. The slave trade is a moneymaker, And so when the Portuguese royal family flees, they set up their new capital in Rio de Janeiro. This keeps the loyalty of the colonial elite, right? Because the colonial elite isn't forced to try and compromise. Who are we loyal to? The king or Napoleon? But the king abdicated to Napoleon. So, right, they can still just be loyal to the king. So that means Brazil is going to develop in a really different way. So, Dom João VI will rule Portugal from Brazil until 1820. And then he will go back to Europe once Napoleon is defeated. So, the king goes back to Portugal, and he leaves his son, Dom Pedro, as regent in Brazil. Well, someone's going to start talking to Dom Pedro and eventually convince him that, hey, why do you need Dad? Why do you need this tiny country on the side of the Iberian Peninsula that doesn't have much to offer? You're in charge of the wealthiest part of the empire. You should just be king. So, in 1822, Dom Pedro I will become a constitutional emperor of Brazil after declaring Brazil independent. So it's a constitutional monarchy, right? It's not a democracy. There will be a decade of civil war and revolution as people desire independence, and Dom Pedro is siding with the revolutionaries. So a key difference here is that Brazil is a constitutional monarchy, not a constitutional republic like its neighbors. So what does the Brazilian Empire look like? Well, in 1824, they will create a liberal constitution. This means you have an elected assembly. Political opponents have rights. You can criticize the government. But if you are the equivalent of a peninsulare, right? If you are Portuguese, born in Europe, living in Brazil, you are completely protected by law. He briefly stops the slave trade, but this proves to be very unpopular. And you see ongoing conflicts between the liberal and conservative groups in Brazil. This is going to be made more complicated by the existence of a monarchy at all, right? So regional revolutions will erupt. Eventually, support for the monarchy will decrease. And in 1865 to 1870, you have the War of Triple Alliance, where it's Paraguay versus Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. And in 1889, a coup will overthrow the emperor and establish Brazil as a republic. While all this is happening, Brazil's reliance on agriculture will continue to grow. Coffee will surpass sugar as the foundation of Brazil's economy, making up 60% sort of their exports. And these coffee estates, the fazendas, will intensify the need for slaves. Similarly, you start to see immigrants from Europe arriving in the New World. So as the Industrial Revolution is going to get ramped up in Europe, you're going to see population increase in Europe and the living conditions decrease. So lots more people think like, hey, why am I living in Europe? Why don't I just go to the New World, right? They're independent states now. So Italian and Portuguese immigrants will arrive for Brazil. Italian immigrants will arrive in huge numbers for Argentina. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we are with Brazil. You need to watch this video. I know I went over the Latin American revolutions really quickly. John Green will go over them in more depth. All right, what about in Canada? Well, in Canada, basically they're like, gosh, perhaps we should be independent as well. So in 1867, they send a letter to Britain being like, Dear Your Majesty, we would like to be independent, please. We will still honor you as queen, and we would like to still have a favorable trade relationship with you. And England's like, okay. It's going to be the Confederation of 1867 leads to a sort of unified Canada with Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia sort of uniting. The Dominion of Canada is with a central government in Ottawa is really seen as the beginning of a Canadian nation. What about South America, big picture, right? Let's take a step back and scale. Britain had allowed for local legislatures and government in Canada and the United States, right? This is going to be one of the things that, will ultimately lead to problems because these local legislatures are like, hey, we create our own laws. We take care of everything. Why do we need the British crown? However, it will also mean that the Americans and the Canadians have already practiced essentially how to self-govern, right? They have systems in place to elect representatives. They have a culture that encourages voting. They have practiced self-governance basically from the get-go. Spain and Portugal had never allowed for any of that. They had always kept tight control over their colonies and had always really feared empowering the Creoles in any way. So that means when the colonists declared independence, they had less experience with legislatures and self-governance. And so they will struggle to limit both church and military power. Okay, let's do some practice questions. So here is our source. It's the execution of Emperor Maximilian. Let me see. Before we do our practice questions, I actually do want to return to Mexico. So, you saw that Mexico was federalist. They're having some trouble. One of the big challenges Latin America is going to face is the influence of the Catholic Church, right? How do you put a check on the Catholic Church? It plays such a large role in everyday life. So in 1832, liberal federalists will be in control, but they will attack, so to speak, the Catholic Church. They want to limit the Catholic Church. Why? Why does it matter? Well, the Catholic Church owned literally half of all the land in Mexico. It was property owned by the Catholic Church, right? And so it's not just of like, oh, well, who cares what the local priest says in his sermon? No, I mean, when you control this much land, and then the question is, do you tax church land, right? This really limits the power of the government. So this attack, this conflict between sort of the liberal government and the Catholic Church will ultimately lead to violence. The result will be Mexico will be unstable, both in terms of social political issues as well as financially very weak. So in 1845, the United States will vote to annex Texas. This is territory that had once been part of Mexico. This will lead to the Mexican-American War, which will go from 1846 to 1848. The United States wins, and in 1848, we sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which the U.S. receives 1/2 of all Mexican territory, but ultimately just 5% of the population, right? California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. We should have gotten Baja too, but we didn't. So we get all of this territory, but not very many people lived up here. And so it's a pretty good deal for us. This, however, presents a real problem for Mexico with like nationalism and sort of forces Mexico to confront their own problems, right? They can't even control their own territory. They're losing it to this new upstart country. So you have the formation of the Second Mexican Empire. It will be led by Benito Juarez, and he will call it La Reforma. Benito Juarez will be the president of Mexico from 1858 to 1872. He's born into poverty, educated as a lawyer, and will rise to become the Chief Justice of the Mexican Supreme Court, and then eventually president. His plans of La Reforma will ultimately really anger conservatives, because when he is elected, he is a liberal, right? He creates a constitution to create a nation of small independent farmers. So he takes the land from the haciendas, from the church, and redistributes it to the poor. So this action of his, La Reforma, will anger the conservatives, leading to a civil war. The conservatives are actually losing the war, so they appeal to Napoleon III over in France for help. Napoleon sends Maximilian von Habsburg, one of his nephews, to Mexico to help. And he will actually take the throne, saying like, well, technically it belongs to me because of complicated, European royal lines. And when Maximilian takes the throne, he manages to piss off both liberals and conservatives who say like, whoa, we didn't want another European king. What the heck? So in 1867, Maximilian will be executed. Juarez will return to office after the French troops are withdrawn. And Juarez's message to the rest of the world is essentially hands off. Mexico needed to promote nation building that would defend itself from foreign powers using violence if necessary. So the Second Mexican Empire is really under Maximilian. And so when Juarez returns to power, you go back to a Mexican republic. In actuality, Juarez is going to become an autocratic ruler in many ways, but a symbol for the nation. You will see that in the end, Porfirio Diaz will succeed Juarez and is a military general. He will ultimately dominate Mexican politics after 1876 as a dictator under the guise of democracy. This will ultimately lead to the Mexican Revolution in 1910. Okay, now let's do those practice questions. So, here is a painting by Manet, The Execution of Emperor Maximilian. Based on your knowledge of world history, a person who was in favor of the execution shown above would most likely agree with which of the following statements? What was the historical context that most directly led up to the event shown above? The overthrow of Venezuelan, Mexican, and Bolivian colonial governments was initially instigated by revolutionary juntas led by, this does not relate to the source, one of the more significant problems facing Latin American independence was okay. For your summary, please explain the causes and effects of various revolutions in the period 1750 to 1900, focusing specifically on Latin America. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.